What if one small detail in a court document quietly changed how this entire case is understood, without changing the verdict at all? A newly unsealed filing doesn't introduce a new suspect, and it doesn't rewrite the timeline. Instead, it raises a single, carefully worded possibility about what may have happened after the attack. A possibility even prosecutors describe as uncertain. And that detail isn't about guilt. It's about interpretation, intention, and how crime scenes can be misunderstood long after a case appears closed. Because even when someone pleads guilty, the evidence still has a story to tell. And not all of it is straightforward. By the time this filing became public, Bryan Kohberger had already entered guilty pleas to 4 counts of first-degree murder in the 2022 University of Idaho case. No trial, no jury debate, 4 life sentences without parole. On the surface, that should have been the end of the story. But court cases don't end when verdicts are reached. They end when every disputed interpretation is either resolved or formally acknowledged as unresolved. And this filing does something unusual. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't dramatize, it doesn't even claim certainty. Instead, it introduces a theory, labeled explicitly as a possibility, based on how investigators interpreted physical evidence found at the scene. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because in criminal investigations, how evidence is interpreted can be just as important as what the evidence is. And this theory focuses on something investigators are always cautious about discussing publicly: the position of victims at a crime scene. According to publicly available court documents, 2 of the victims, Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogan, were found together in one bedroom. They had been sharing a bed that night, something that was already known early in the investigation. What changed with this newly unsealed filing was not where they were found, but how their final positions may have come to be. A defense-retained crime scene expert reviewed autopsy summaries and scene documentation and suggested that, after both victims were unresponsive, their positioning might not reflect their original locations at the moment of the attack. The expert's wording was careful: no claims of motive, no statements of certainty, only that the evidence could be interpreted that way. So why would this even matter, if guilt was already established? Because criminal courts don't just determine who is responsible. They also record how conclusions were reached and which interpretations remain debatable. Prosecutors addressed the theory directly in the filing. They did not dismiss it outright. They did not endorse it either. Instead, they described it as a possibility, not a determination. They explained that the same physical indicators cited by the defense expert could also be explained by natural movement during the incident or by other uncontrollable factors. And critically, prosecutors emphasize something courts often repeat: even if movement occurred, it may be impossible to determine intent behind it. That single sentence quietly limits how far speculation can responsibly go. And this is where the story shifts, away from the crime itself and toward something far more subtle. How the justice system handles uncertainty after accountability has already been established, because this filing wasn't about changing Kohberger's sentence. It was about the record. One reason this theory gained attention is where it came from, not from speculation, not from social media, but from how medical findings were summarized inside a legal filing. It's important to be precise here. The document does not include full autopsy reports. It references selected findings that were relevant to expert testimony. Nothing more. That distinction matters, because autopsy summaries are designed for legal clarity, not storytelling. They answer questions like, were injuries consistent with the timeline? Do findings align with the scene documentation? Are there alternative explanations that must be acknowledged? They are not meant to reconstruct moments, and courts are careful not to treat them that way. So how did a medical summary turn into a discussion about positioning? Through something investigators constantly evaluate: patterns versus movement. In the filing, the defense expert referenced the location of blood transfer on bedding and pillows. The argument was not that the evidence proved repositioning, but that it allowed for the possibility of it. That difference is subtle, but legally massive, because in court, saying, "this happened," and saying, "this could have happened," are worlds apart. Prosecutors responded by pointing out that similar patterns can occur through natural body movement, gravity shifts, caused during the incident itself, all of which are well documented in forensic literature. In other words, the evidence didn't contradict the prosecution's case. It simply didn't eliminate every alternative explanation. And that brings us to a question most people never think to ask. Why release this filing after a guilty plea? When Kohberger accepted a plea agreement, the case moved into a different legal phase. There was no trial, no cross-examination in open court, no competing expert testimony presented to a jury. But the court record still had to be finalized. That includes expert disclosures, responses to expert theories, clarifications on what is agreed upon, true, and what is not, unsealing. This filing wasn't about reopening the case. It was about transparency. Courts are obligated to preserve an accurate public record, especially in cases of significant public interest. And transparency doesn't always provide comfort. Sometimes it simply confirms that not every question has a clean answer. By the time this document became public, Kohberger had already formally admitted responsibility for all 4 murders. There was no ambiguity on guilt, no competing suspect, no unresolved legal outcome. What remained unresolved were interpretive details, the kind that matter to historians, legal analysts, and families seeking understanding rather than verdicts. That distinction is critical. Uncertainty in interpretation does not equal uncertainty in responsibility. The justice system allows both to coexist. And this is where the conversation often goes wrong online, because nuance doesn't spread as fast as certainty, and careful language doesn't travel as far as definitive claims. One of the most deliberate choices in this filing is what it doesn't try to explain. There is no attempt to assign meaning, no psychological conclusions, no claims about symbolism or motive. And that's not an oversight, it's a boundary. In criminal law, outcomes can often be documented with evidence. Intent, however, almost never can. Even when physical actions are clear, the reason behind them often remains unknowable unless explicitly stated by the person responsible. That's why prosecutors included a key clarification. Even if movement occurred, the true intentions behind it could not be determined. That single line closes the door on speculation intentionally. So if intent can't be proven, why acknowledge the possibility at all? Because courts don't exist to tell the most dramatic version of events. They exist to tell the most accurate one, even when accuracy includes uncertainty. Motive is powerful in public storytelling, but legally, motive is not required for conviction. In this case, prosecutors had physical evidence, timeline alignment, a confession through a guilty plea. They did not need motive to establish responsibility. Introducing speculative interpretations about intent could have created legal noise, not clarity. So instead, the filing sticks to what can be responsibly stated, what evidence shows, what it does not conclusively show, and where interpretation must stop. That restraint is intentional and rare in high-profile cases. And it ties directly into another often misunderstood part of this case, the role of witnesses and physical traces. Despite the later discussions about interpretation, the core evidence in this case remained unchanged. Investigators recovered a knife sheath at the scene, which later became a critical link through forensic testing. That item, combined with digital and circumstantial evidence, ultimately placed Kohberger at the center of the investigation. Additionally, a surviving roommate provided an eyewitness account that, while limited, helped establish a timeline. None of this evidence was challenged by the filing. The discussion about positioning did not weaken the case, it existed alongside it, which leads to the most important distinction of all. A case can be legally complete and still emotionally incomplete. For families, understanding is not always about verdicts, it's about context, clarity, and knowing that every reasonable question was examined, even if not every question had an answer. This filing didn't reopen wounds. It documented that the system looked carefully and stopped where certainty ended. That matters more than many people realize, because when cases like this enter public memory, they often lose their nuance. And nuance is where responsibility lives. One of the quiet lessons in this case has nothing to do with shock or mystery. It's about restraint. Forensic evidence is powerful, but it is not a narrator. It does not explain itself. It does not assign meaning. It offers data and asks humans to interpret it carefully. That's why this filing matters, even now. Not because it changes the outcome, but because it demonstrates how the justice system records uncertainty instead of erasing it. And in a public environment that often demands definitive answers, that choice is intentional. Because outside the courtroom, stories tend to simplify. Inside it, complexity is preserved, even when it's uncomfortable. High-profile cases often take on a second life online. Headlines compress, details flatten, possibilities become conclusions. But legal records work in the opposite direction. They slow things down. They qualify statements. They separate evidence from interpretation. That's exactly what happened here. The filing didn't tell the most dramatic version of events. It documented the most responsible one. And that difference is easy to miss unless you're looking for it. So what does this case actually teach us? Beyond the headlines? It shows how a case can be fully resolved legally, yet still carefully examined afterward, without reopening guilt or assigning new meaning. It also shows why responsible coverage matters, because speculation doesn't just misinform. It overshadows the process designed to protect accuracy. This filing didn't sensationalize, it didn't accuse, it didn't dramatize, it acknowledged limits. In the end, this wasn't a revelation meant to shock, it was a reminder that justice isn't only about conclusions, it's about documenting how those conclusions were reached and where certainty ends. And that's something the public rarely gets to see, because sometimes the most important parts of a case are the ones that don't make the front page.